And welcome back to Frankly Speaking. I'm your host, Frank. Let's call this volume 14 of the Integralist Chronicles. Well, tonight, I want to go backwards and go back to 1989. That was the year I graduated from high school. And, well, for most of my youth, I was an awkward kind of a child, in a way, a little socially backwards to a certain extent. 1989 was a big year. It was that moment where, you left in my case, the public education system, and you went out into the real world. And there was really nothing more confusing for me at the time, because the way I was raised in an immigrant household versus the outside world, and the values of my home were sort of in stark contrast to one another. And so I was raised by my parents, to, essentially be a family man, right? And to look for a wife, get married, start my own family. And it's something that I always desired from a very young age. And while in some respects I was socially awkward, in another way, I was married. Well, I was ready for marriage at a very young age, at least mentally, socially, in that regard. But I had my challenges as I had really no direction in a liberal society. Now, things for me were a little bit more complex, as I would find out years later on, because I suffer from muscular dystrophy, and things in the workforce became very difficult for me. And sort of finding my way in a liberal society was a little bit difficult on top of it all. My ambition growing up was not one to pursue economic prosperity. Well, obviously, you had to work, earn a living. I had this thing about, okay, you got to build a life. I get that. But the drive to get there, because one of the issues that I struggled from is my family, at least my mother and my father, were not highly educated. And so in that sense, it's just about, okay, just go to work hard, and you make something of yourself. I couldn't pick up the family business because of my limitations physically. My father was, he was a bricklayer, made a good living, an honest living, hard worker. That's why when I started hearing about the American Protestant work ethic, it was kind of quite confusing to me, because as I've said so many times before, nobody worked harder than the Italian immigrants, right? It came from a world where you either worked hard or you literally starved in that world. And so oftentimes you see this from classical liberals and conservatives, where they throw everybody who are not making it in the usurious banking economy that we have in America as being lazy if they're not partaking of it and succeeding in this American economy. Now, my father was very successful. He was a smart guy. For man that never had any formal education, my father was born in 1935 in Sicily during the reign of Benito Mussolini. World War II, of course, starts right there, right about 1940. And so he's in the midst of a war as a child, 7, 8, 9 years old, as the bombing runs start in Sicily, the invasion of Sicily by, I believe it was it Patton? No, it wasn't Patton. Was it MacArthur and Montgomery were the two generals for the Americans and the British in 43. And I believe the month was April. And my father always told me the stories of that world. And that world, again, as I said before, in a previous cast here, this is why this idea of the Bible, and being intellectually sound in our theological causes as Catholics was impossible for a lot of Catholics, because lots of the Catholic world was or didn't have any forms of educational systems in place. This is what happens when revolutions overrun your nations, or even worse, world wars, right? And so I came from a family with a very low level education. I think my mother had something like, sorry about that. something like an equivalent to sixth grade education, because in those days in Sicily in the 40s and the 50s, women didn't really get educations, right? It wasn't the emphasis. That culture, again, tried to mold young ladies into being wives and mothers ultimately. It wasn't this, feminist thing that we have in America, which was another confusing thing, as immigrants here, where men and women were in competition with one another, where in the old world, in the old country, in the fatherland, they were complementary to one another, right? Men and women were expected to work together as a nucleus for the betterment of the family and society as a whole. But in America, it's a little bit different because everybody gets thrown into the usury work system here, and then you wonder why we have a situation where abortion, contraception, to break up the family, all this stuff ensues as a result to support that different moral system of sorts, if you want to call that. And so it was very difficult in the sense that I wasn't driven by higher education, and without the higher education, you fell behind. Because in my day, what they were preaching is you got to go to college, 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 college. That's what was being preached in the 80s. I mean, we think about that as a new modern phenomenon with the millennials and all the student loan debt, but that was the case in my days. And if you weren't going to go to college because I didn't have that academic background in my family, then obviously you take on something more of a physical trade skill. And I didn't have the physical ability to do that. So I found myself as a young man in no man's land in many respects. And what ends up happening for me is I floundered for many years. I did, until I met my wife later on in life. And as a young man with the burning passion, desire of chasing young ladies in my early years, I found myself in another social quandary. And that is, here I am, the son of an immigrant, all these Italian Catholic values being taught in my house, but the world outside my house was anything but that. It was very American and it was very liberal. And in many ways, they conflicted with one another. And the question was, what do you do here? Now, ideally, I think in those days, Italian immigrants, when they had children here and they were looking to, I guess, get them married off to try and form families, obviously you try to find other Italian families to kind of, have families play a role in regard to getting their kids married off. It made sense. Italians, parents kind of getting together. It wasn't fixed marriages, but Italian families would kind of look for that at some point. But the problem was, again, was Americanization. And along with Americanization, liberalization. And so with the notion of modern love in America being one more of one of passion rather than one steeped in social structures and morality, well, what did that mean for Italian offspring? Now I can speak from it from a male perspective, right? And that's what I'm going to give to you here. And I don't want to sit here and just bash on the ladies, because I'm sure, and I know this for a fact, that even the male offspring of Italian immigrants, they were broken. I saw the men go the wayside with drugs and rapid sexual experimentation and crime and nefarious issues that a liberal society presents to you. But from my experience, when I started dating, it was difficult because the idea of marrying another Italian family to keep the hegemony, the Italian hegemony, became very difficult because liberalism had began to consume everything morally, culturally, and the moral disorders of the time were rampant. I mean, we're growing up now in a liberal society where the church is not the arbiter of truth anymore. Freedom and liberty, sort of a laissez-faire morality, was the governing body of laws in America, right? It's you pursue marriage for love, you pursue marriage for passion. Now, for us Catholics and Italians who had a social structure in Italy, we weren't, as immigrants at least, the revolutionary spirit was strange to us because we always had cultural and religious conformity. But again, we're not in Italy anymore. And you have to assimilate. And to a certain extent, yeah, you do have to assimilate. I get that. But that moral contradiction that exists in America, particularly that of the Protestant spirit of subjective morality, began to run rampant through Italian communities. And I could tell you, as I was growing up as a young man, graduating 89, 90, 91, 92, 93, and I'm starting to date and looking for a partner, a wife to possibly, get married in the sacrament of marriage. What I found was that most of the Italian girls in the local community that I lived in Los Angeles, they were broken. They were all morally bankrupt by that point. Liberalism had run rampant. And listen, the moment you put, whether it's boys or girls in the public school system, there's a 99% chance they're going to be bankrupted. And in many ways, I was too at the time. I just always had a certain moral compunction about me that while I struggled with the fallen nature of our world and liberalism indoctrinating even and really poisoning my mind, I always kept a sense of that cultural hegemony and religious hegemony of the old world that I believed in. It just made sense to me. I was one of the few kids during my days where I never even tried drugs, right? Everybody says, well, all kids try drugs, at least marijuana, right? I never even tried marijuana. I didn't drink much. I actually hardly drank at all. Especially when I was young. I didn't do the marijuana thing. And so for me, there was always a moral compunction. But in the dating world, in a society that is now pushing sexual immorality in your face all the time, it becomes difficult to abstain from that world that is seducing everybody around you. And looking for another Italian mate to keep the culture hegemony became very difficult, because it wasn't just the sexuality with Italian women, Italian young ladies in the culture that I was raised in. It was the pursuit of rampant materialism that really is what got the ladies. They lost their understanding of sacrificial love and building a life with a partner through marriage, which was something odd and strange because my parents' generation, grandparents' generation, obviously material means always plays a role because we live in the real world. But there was, again, through our Catholic faith, an understanding of sacrificial love, and that, sort of the pursuit of this material world, at least in Italy and Sicily, maybe because it was more of an impoverished nation, um, you know, but in America, it was different. America was the land of opportunity. And in that sense, when you have a society that's focused on dialectic materialism, what happens to women in that culture, right? They pursue men with power and money. That's what it became. And so for somebody like me who struggled early in my youth to find myself, that became a problem. And so what winds up happening is, and this happened to a lot of Italian men, right? One, struggling through the sexualization of our culture, porn becoming mainstream in the 80s and 90s. And all of a sudden now, what would be the cultural matches of other Italian girls, well, now they're pursuing sort of the top stakeholders of our society, right? It has been said, right, that a man can walk into a bar, a wealthy man, well-off man, good-looking man, very successful and powerful, can walk into a bar or even a McDonald's and sees the cute girl behind the counter, says, I want her, I want to make her my wife. The social status of a woman or the financial status of a woman doesn't matter. Men are attracted to beauty. Men are attracted to femininity, right? And men don't look for a career woman. Oftentimes that conflicts with the male nature. But women are fundamentally different. And in that regard, women are generally not loyal to their tribe. And so when women are disloyal to their tribe, right, they will go to where they have to go to fulfill that monetary, financial, that social status that women are constantly looking for. And hence became the intermixing of races, the intermixing of cultures, and with that begins to break down the mindset of the immigrant, but also the Catholic culture and the Catholic society. And this was spread through other cultures as well, too, Catholic cultures. I grew up with predominantly Italians, Croatians, Hispanics, and what you began to see is cultural hegemony, religious hegemony break down, the intermixing of marriages, because America was a land of tolerance and diversity. But with that came lots of social disorders. And the problems that we're now living through today, in large part, took a foothold in that generation. As I said before, by the time we get to the 90s, we get the complete moral breakdown, the complete sexualization of American culture. That's when I've pinned it to, and in the series I talked about it before. And so now, with women being of a different nature than men, not being loyal to their tribes, women will simply go to the finish line and they will screw the winner. That's what women do. That is their tendency, especially in a liberal society that doesn't emphasize faith, religion, culture, or that matter. If you create a society based on sort of the, what do you want to call it, the material dialectic, right? Why wouldn't women react to their fallen nature, or at least to, well, their nature in general, to pursue the man that could take care of them? The problem with that is you break down cultural, sort of cultural hegemony, which creates a lot of other problems. And by the time we get to the 90s, we see the complete sexualization of Catholic families and Catholic offspring. And it was very interesting because it was Catholic women, young ladies, that were sleeping around with all the men. It was Catholic ladies that were getting pregnant and ultimately breaking away from their Catholic heritage, right? And so you have the intermixing of faith, you have the intermixing of culture. And as we've seen, the byproduct was not only just a lack of hegemony, but also a rising divorce rate as we get into the 90s, because the fundamental problem is this, right? Catholics are fine when they marry other Catholics and you have the same common values. But the divorce rate in the Catholic community really picks up when we're now marrying not Catholics anymore, but we're marrying Jews, or we're marrying Protestants, or you even have interracial marriages in that respect, because values conflict, right? You can look at the studies all over the place that show that the intermixing of marriages by different cultures and races, they tend to struggle more. Now, I'm not against interracial marriage. I didn't marry an Italian woman, and I've been in a wonderful marriage now for almost 22 years. Me and my wife, we're soulmates all the way to the end. Devout Catholics, we love the faith. And as long as the faith is in place, to a certain degree in America, I think you can marry and be successful. But the moment there's a confliction with the faith, because ultimately the culture is going to break down. We get that, right? We have to assimilate into American liberal culture. The only thing that you have left that could keep any sense of order within the realm of the family now is the faith. It's the Catholic faith. And so often what you began to see is Catholic women that are going to the finish line, they're finding Protestants and Jews to marry or to interact with. And those are the marriages that first lead to divorce, first and foremost. Not that Catholic marriages weren't increasing also in divorce, the purely Catholic marriages. But generally, this is the tendency, right? At the time, Italians tended not to not marry other Italians. I forget what the word is, when you marry within your own race. But we began to see women breaking away from that, Italian women, in the pursuit of their material ambitions in this world. And it is the nature of women. And that's where things became rough. They became difficult because Italian offspring now were liberalizing. They weren't married into the faith. They were married people of other cultures and other religions. And with that comes the sort of the dissolution of morality and a lot of the problems that we now face. Now, in that regard, I'm not going to sit here and blame just women. I saw a lot of the Italian men struggle through great immorality at that time as well, too. And you could argue that many Italian men from the immigrant offshoots were struggling in their own right, without a doubt, and maybe they weren't marriage material themselves, and it was a struggle in that respect. So you could argue that both of the sexes struggled. But I think the point I'm making here is the difficulty was Italian immigration, and for that matter, all immigration, struggling to conform in a liberal society all of a sudden. And it was strange for my parents and even more so my grandparents' generation. Now, I was on the West Coast, okay? And so this is first generation immigration that came in the 60s. I'm not talking about the Italian immigration that came in the late 1800s, early 1900s back east. I'm out west in Los Angeles. This is really the last wave of immigration that came in the 60s. And we're still trying to hold on to some, I guess, what do you call it, vestiges of the old world of the faith, right? We bring over the celebration, the feast day of Saint Joseph, which was so prevalent or was such a part of our culture over there. We're trying to maintain it. We still speak the language at that time, and so trying to figure all of this out in an ever hyper sexualized society, liberal society based on rebellion, you begin to see the fundamental breakdown of the Catholic family. And I think, as I said before, as long as my grandparents' generation was alive, there was still a certain sense of morality. It will start to break down. You made sure grandma didn't see this stuff. You kept it hidden out of the way. But now that my grandparents' generation, that pre-World War II generation, right? That was born during a time more closer to World War I. Once they begin to die off, well, then all what do you call it? The veil of shame and blame just collapses at that point. And so we get to this 1960s sexual revolution. It goes into the 70s, right? We have sort of this cultural influence of liberalism, the sexual revolution. We're watching shows like Three's Company and things of that nature that are showing people living out of wedlock becoming normal. Now, in the 80s, it was a mixed bag because the Protestants were already shacking up out of wedlock because of their subjective morality. Some Catholics were starting to do it, but a lot of Catholics were still keeping that hidden, right? But once we get to the 90s, it was completely gone. The veil of again of the old Catholic morality had completely collapsed, and now you had Catholic women, Catholic of the offspring of that of immigrants that now were fully blown moral degenerates, and for that part, so were men, right? So were men in a lot of ways, but it is women that controls, or should I say, it is women that has been said that are the gatekeepers of morality. And women can be a powerful moral force when they subscribe to the faith, when they're pursuing the faith with virtue, with obedience, with piety. And oftentimes a good woman settles down a man that could be a little bit wilder because of our nature. And that's why marriage is so important to men. Men need marriage. Yeah, so do women, don't get me wrong. But men need marriage because it is women that is the civilizing moral force that matures a man. But what happens when a man, or should I say, women have liberalized and women have foregone that wonderful gift that God has given them to be reasonable and rational and to be sort of the arbiters of morality within society. The moment we put women on the pill in the 1960s, the nature of women changes. And we go from men and women being complementary creatures to now we're in the battle of the sexes. But see, not all women bought it. And that's why I say women decided in this material dialectic world where the only real good was making the money in America, right? They just went to the finish line. They went to the finish line. They weren't willing to put up with the same struggle. Not only their parents, but their grandparents were willing to put up within the realm of marriage. Because now we had a usury system, a system that we're told is the great, most prosperous civilization history of the world in the American society. Granted, a lot of it now was being done on printed money, which I would question some of that, but clearly for the everyday American society was more prosperous. So there was more options for women to pursue men of different cultures, races, religion, like I said, go to the finish line. And that presented problems within the Catholic communities, the Italian Catholic immigrant communities, and hegemony began to break down. And now we're seeing the after effects of that, right? We're seeing the effects now of these non-homogeneous Catholic Italian immigrant families that have forever not only lost their Italian identity, but their Catholic identity as well. And everything has to be watered down to the lowest common denominator. And as I said to you so many times, right, my experience has been first goes the language, then goes the culture, then goes the faith. That's been the experience that I've seen as a byproduct of immigration. And then, of course, you throw into that mix the global economy where everybody is moving around. I mean, listen, I'm in this strange place, even for myself. I moved away from Los Angeles about 25 years ago, maybe a little bit more than that. And so I don't even belong to an Italian community anymore. And in many ways, I've lost my social identity, my cultural identity. I'm out in the Midwest now with a bunch of Protestants, and it's a different world that I live in. And in many ways, being isolated and alone, not only as Italian, but as a Catholic, it's a strange place. And it does leave sort of this emptiness within you for the desire of culture and faith in a real and true and meaningful way. But this is what the world has thrown at me. And so when I talk to you about these Italian communities, it's through my experience back in that era, particularly in the 80s and 90s. I can't really speak from experience about what has happened since that time, but in general, talking to people, it hasn't gotten any better, without a doubt. In fact, I bought E. Michael Jones' book. I know he's a controversial figure, but I bought E. Michael Jones' book, The Slaughter of Cities. And he highlights, starting in the 30s and 40s, how the Protestant ruling class started to break down Catholic hegemony in the cities. And it's interesting because, you know, we've seen the deterioration of Catholic societies and cultures all over the place. The global economy, like I said, hasn't helped. And so the question has been, right, for many immigrants and Catholic sort of offspring, right? What is the purpose of being here in America at this point? Because if you talk to many of the classical liberals who have many contradictory points, like Glenn Beck, for example, he was offended a few weeks back, a few months ago, actually, the idea, the notion that America simply offers material prosperity as its grand prize of sorts to be an American. And he has said, well, making the money in America, when was that ever a thing? He's trying to, again, dispel the notion that there's something deeper about America. And my suspicions would be the idea of religious liberty and freedom and all those things that go back to the founding. But I think what Mr. Beck doesn't understand is that not everybody came from oppressed societies. And that is because not everybody was rebelling from the societies they were coming from. You have to remember, for Catholics, it was an experience and a trauma of revolutions and world wars that affected those Catholic nations being attacked both by Western liberalism and by communism. It's a fundamentally different social structure and sort of sort of inception into American life than, say, the Protestant rebels of the revolutionary times, where they were breaking away to sort out all the warring factions of Protestantism, right? So they create this narrative that they're casting off the shackles of the tyrannical monarch and pursuing freedom and liberty and freedom of speech and all these natural laws concocted by John Locke and many of the founding fathers. Because Protestantism is part of that rebellion. It was a rebellion, a Christian offshoot. And in that regards, as I said before, once you go down the path of rebellion, once you go down the path of revolution, who is the moral arbiter to ever declare the revolution ever be over? You don't have one. That's why American culture has always been revolutionary, right? As I said to you so many times, one of the things that was very odd and strange as an immigrant was the fact that the American family was always in the state of constant revolution, and how one generation in America always rebels against their parents' generation. And it's strange as a Catholic, as an Italian, because that's not the tendency, at least of Italians. And I know for a fact other Catholic cultures like the Filipinos, the Mexicans, and a few others, they never rebelled against their parents. In fact, like many of the Asian pagan nations, our elders are honored and revered and respected, right? I always had a close relationship with my mother. And for that matter, a lot of people call me a mama's boy because of that. But that's just how Italian boys are. We're close to our parents. We don't feel the need to rebel. I saw this thing on TikTok. No, not TikTok. YouTube Shorts. I don't have TikTok. I don't deal with TikTok. YouTube Shorts, where like one of those lists. 5 things you'll never hear an Italian say, right? And one of them was, okay, when you're 18, you got to get out of the house. We don't say that to our kids. Our kids stay home until they get married. And that's how it was for me. It's how it's going to be for my kids. And it's again that idea of going out into the world, making something of yourself, morality being very not subjective, but also it's a secondary issue, because in America, again, we're pursuing this materialistic thing. What's most important in America? You go out there and you learn how to make the money in America. You go to college, right? Now, as I've said so many times before, it's a strange thing in America to me. Again, being the byproduct of immigration, that you would send your kids in a liberal society to one of these universities for what? To experiment with sex, drugs, rock and roll, and to be indoctrinated into communism effectively. We call that a rite of passage in America. From our Catholic Italian perspective, we always saw that as crazy. Now, many Italian Catholics bought into that eventually, because that's what you got to do in America, is go to college, right? And so you send your child off now, if you want to call them a child, 18, 19, 20 years old, into this world, into this rite of passage of in a hedonistic society, to partake of our very fallen natures that will make many of us disordered. And then you wonder why the family has broken down. You wonder why we have all this great moral and social dysfunctions in America that we have today. Because we always emphasize the material first. That's more important, that you get a career, you get a job, you make the money in America. And the moral health, that is a personal choice in America, right? You do you, I do me. And as long as we don't cross each other's property lines, we don't shoot each other, right? That's American morality in a nutshell. And that has reverberated in American politics, right? particularly the political right, the big tent approach, right? We don't judge anybody. We have this sort of libertarian-esque kind of morality where we don't judge personal morality. Religion is a personal individual choice. It's what do you want to call it? Not just subjective morality, but indifferent morality that has encompassed the American spirit in modern times. Maybe older Protestant denominations in maybe the first century of America's existence were more doctrinal in their morality. But as I said before, once you go down the path of revolution, what's going to stop the next generation from revolting against you, right? It's the very problem we have at the Civil War, where the South was saying to the North, wait a minute, we don't like what you're dictating to us. We're going to rebel, just like you rebelled against your monarch, right? Just like you rebelled against George III. We're going to use the same philosophical principle to break away. See, once you go down the path of revolution, it never ends. What is your moral arbiter of truth? Protestants don't have the concept of faith and religion of a structured church as a moral arbiter like Catholics do. Every individual Protestant with Bible in hand, in many respects, becomes his own authority. Well, we as Catholics have a social structure that we follow that keeps uniformity in regards to morals and values and social structure. In America, we don't have those social structures. That's the odd thing about it. So when the likes of Glenn Beck are saying in bewilderment, because he's hearing now that that in America it's all about making the money, the money, the money, and he takes an offense to that because he's trying to appeal to some greater moral principles at the founding. He said, well, wait a minute, when did America become about making money? Well, Glenn, I don't know what you're referring to, but that's exactly why most immigrants came. Most immigrants came starting sometime in the mid-1800s for economic viability. Sure, you had some of the Irish come who were being persecuted by the Protestants, right? In England, right? You had some of that. But many of them were coming from impoverished nations to look for opportunity. In fact, you know what? That movie Cabrini, right? Whatever you may think of it, there is a moment in that movie where Mother Cabrini is being sold the idea of coming to America to help the Italian immigrants. And what they were being told at the time is that America is so prosperous, that the streets are paved in gold. And this was a real thing at that time. Remember, this is before mass transit, mass communications. A lot of the stuff going back to the old country is rumors, it's hearsay. And there's a lot of I guess, a big industry to get immigrants to come to America because, again, America is a Protestant nation. It's already contracepting. It needs immigration. It needs that underclass to help build the infrastructure of the nation. You had to sell a product to convince immigrants to come. For at least the Italians that start coming in late 1800s, early 1900s, they're not leaving because of some grand persecution against freedom and liberty. No, I mean, there was clearly social disorder because the French Revolution was running rampant. But for the most part, Italians loved Italy, even after World War II or during World War II, during the reign of Benito Mussolini, which is one of the most misrepresented parts of Italian history ever. Nobody was fleeing Italy because of persecution. Now, you might have had leftist political dissidents that might have done that, without a doubt, that always happens. But in general, Italians loved Italy. And it was kind of a melancholy, kind of bittersweet moment when Italians had to leave Italy. And it had to do with a lack of economic viability, one through political instability throughout the late 1800s all the way through the early 1900s, but also because Italy's infrastructure was difficult to build because it lacked many natural resources that in America we never lacked. But what America lacked was that underclass, sort of working class, because the Protestants weren't having enough children. They're already starting to contracept. Some Protestants were, but in large part, we see the Protestant churches at the time already begin to sort of relent on certain moral principles. I think it was the Lutheran Church right around 1930 that passed a decree in one of their councils or meetings, whatever it was, okaying the use of contraception. And it's that period that really gets us to the sexual revolution. But for Glenn Beck, it's like I like to tell Glenn that the very reason why many, at least Italians, came, and I would argue probably many Asians and many people of other different races from all over the world, they came because we were sold that America is the land of opportunity. You don't come to America for what? Culture? You come to America for what? Religion? Not really. America's kind of in different attitude toward religion. Is kind of all backward ass, to be honest with you. It's all indifferent. It's all backward ass. Religion's been thrown into the economic sphere, into the strip mall kind of Christianity thing that we have going on here. Are you coming here for the food? Are you coming here for the culture? What are you coming here? No, you're sold on economic prosperity, that we can make a better way of life for us because there's a greater opportunity here for various reasons, right? Greater resources, lack of wars between traditionally warring tribes that we had in Europe. Wars didn't disproportionately hit America either, that interrupted sort of the infrastructure of the nation. There was simply lots of benefits, and the sheer geography and land where people could stay away from each other, even when they did disagree with each other. Well, Europe was a much more consolidated continent with historical, well, problems between warring tribes. It wasn't so much that Europeans were inferior, because in many ways, America is a byproduct of Europe. But again, I know we have to build our egos here in America and say we're exceptional, we're better than anybody else, when in fact we're an offshoot of that. Americans aren't good with nuance and understanding history outside of American history, and that's part of the sort of the pseudo religion that has been made since the progressive era of American society, late 1800s, early 1900s. And that pseudo religion we've created, I think, has blinded many Americans. And so, so when the immigrants came here, at least my family, we were grateful for the opportunity, without a doubt. And we came here, we kept our heads down, we worked hard, that's what we did. But then came sort of the social fabric and the breakdown of culture and family that ensues really in all liberal societies. I know as Americans, we like to set ourselves apart, right? The shining city on a hill, the last best hope for mankind, right? Manifest destiny. We are special, American excellence. But, I mean, if you look at America, we're being honest, they've suffered from the same problems that every other liberal society has suffered from. It's no different. I mean, you could try and set aside our Constitution. That's fine. Okay. I respect the Constitution, and maybe it has some structures that were better and stronger than, say, a place like Australia. I get that. But eventually the liberal society breaks it all down anyways. America has been no different in fending off liberalism and ultimately communism than every other liberal republic on the face of the planet. We could try and sit here and build ourselves up as being the greatest thing in the history of the world, but we've liberalized at a massively rapid pace. I mean, the Europeans might have had a 20, 30, 40-year head start because they had the Bolsheviks right there, right on their doorsteps, right? Before mass transit, before mass communications. But the Bolsheviks are here now, right? Or the communists are here now. And we don't know how to deal with it. And we're liberalizing just as fast as Europe has been liberalizing. I've always said that, America was simply 20 years behind, 2 decades behind Europe in liberalization. And now with mass transit and mass communication, our form of liberalism here is digressing. It's falling apart just as fast as the Europeans are falling apart now. It's just the Europeans now have had a head start for a long time. So, and maybe for me, I'm stuck in a time warp at this point. Maybe you say, well, Frank, listen, Italy and all those European Catholic nations have liberalized. Yes, they have, just as much as America has at this point. I get that. But, it was post-World War II democracy and liberalism that was imposed after the war on those nations. Those Catholic nations fought off liberalism for as long as they could. They literally were bombed into oblivion. Not that the French Revolution wasn't creeping in some ways. I think if you went to the cities in Italy at that time, you had issues there too. It's always been a fight, and the church has been attacked by liberalism and masonry and things of all this nature for a long time. But the war really really dooms Catholic civilization, and it's been an uphill battle since. I guess the only thing I wonder is, while Europe struggles right now, it's being invaded by a migrant force over there. It's liberalizing over there. I just wonder if one day its history, its Catholic history, will at least give it a chance to revive itself. I just don't see it in America. It's just, it was a liberal society from origin, and that liberalism has consumed everybody. It's consumed Protestants, it's consumed Jews, it's consumed Catholics, and now we're all trying to figure out what's next. We've lost faith in the political system, but like I said, at that time in the 80s and then going into the 90s, we began to see the eradication of the Catholic family. Those immigrant families that came from Italy, they couldn't protect their offspring from sexualization, the pursuit of that materialistic thing that America promises, which is not all bad, but it can be taken to an extreme. And I saw extremes of it within the Italian community. And so where does this all leave us? It leaves us with broken culture and broken families, and the essence of Italian communities dying off. I know, according to E. Michael Jones, what the Protestants and the Protestant ruling class didn't help. It helped break down Catholic societies and cultures, and the government hasn't been all that, all toward, appeasing toward immigrants and Catholic communities. Government doesn't like a challenge in that respect, and here we are, right? And this is why you find many offspring of Italians, right? They call themselves Italians. Many of them don't speak the language anymore. Many of them really don't recognize the culture. The culture they do recognize is more of a commercialized culture in many ways. They have a last name, but they don't speak the language. They really don't know the culture. They've lost the faith. And once that happens, are you really even Italian anymore? It's a question I've asked myself, and it's a problem that's my children are gonna face. I think with me, it's different because I'm a direct first generation byproduct. I speak the language. I partook in the culture. My family was from that culture. My mother and father were full-blooded Sicilians. And so in that sense, I experience it. I know it. I understand it. Granted, in many ways, I'm stuck in a time warp because we have been in America now for 60 years. And with that, I'm just as much American as I am Italian at this point. But again, what does being an American mean, right? It's a very fluid, loose term. It's a very abstract term. It's easier for me to come to grips with my Italian Catholic heritage because there's concrete principles in place that guide us through life, while in America, it's simply about the pursuit of passions, which at times can be good, but can be destructive, right? And these are some of the things that many Italians struggle with. And as we intermix with Protestants and Jews and different races, things of that nature, it deludes the Italian culture, the Italian language, and eventually it destroys the faith in all of us. And that's why I think the big struggle in America today is we have a massive identity crisis. It's why we're at the streets fighting each other, right? All these disordered relationships, these disordered lifestyles. These are broken individuals that not have just broken down morally, they've broken down culturally. Their families are broken. They're looking for an identity. I heard this conversation today of all these converts that are coming over to Catholic faith, right? Like the Candace Owens and the Jordan Peterson and the Russell Brand. And the question is, are we having a Christian revival in America at this point in history? And to a certain extent, I think on an individual basis, revivals can happen, but on a grander societal scale, I don't see it. American civilization, American culture is broken, it's dead, and I think it lacks some fundamental structures from the very beginning that's led us here. And nobody knows how to get this, this thing back in order. We've tried to turn our political system into a pseudo religion to try and correct a lot of the problems of the breakdown of society and culture. But democracy is problematic all the way around, and many people are trying to figure out, okay, what is this? What is America now at this point? Where do we go from here? Because everything is pushing us toward more radical elements of liberalism, whether it's communism or the disordered life, the disordered relationships. Those are the voices that are the loudest. Those are the voices that continue to push people away from traditional faith and traditional families. And what I'm seeing is, in many offspring of Italians, they're all caving into the liberal culture. They don't want to fight the fight anymore, and they're just living life every day to pursue the basic metrics of our human needs every day, with the loss of spirituality, with the loss of culture, with the loss of faith, with the loss of national identity. It's all been wiped out, and that's going to cause problems with people that are looking for deeper meaning in life to simply go out there. Okay, I got my cell phone and I got my condominium in New York, and okay, I'm gonna go have my cup of espresso, my $5 latte, and go do some yoga at the gym, right? Because there's more to life than that. This really simple, abstract, this menial life. There's no greater purpose of meaning. There's no greater purpose of culture. There's no greater purpose of faith. That's what we've lost. That's why people are struggling. That's why the family is breaking down. That's why the culture is a hot pile of manure. And it's why the political system is corrupt. This is what I've experienced in my life as a byproduct of immigration. I want to thank you for joining me. This is volume 14 of the Integralist Chronicles. This is Frank signing off. Good night, everybody.